All right, so we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today, huh? Consequences of Capitalism by Noam Chomsky and Marv Waterstone.
Yeah, this one's a thinker for sure.
Definitely. You know, what really struck me is it's not just like a straightforward textbook.
Right.
It weaves in all these voices from like activists and people on the ground.
It's like getting multiple perspectives on the same issue, which is so important.
Exactly. And honestly, some of the stuff is kind of mind-blowing. I mean, did you know that like the U.S. military budget is higher now than it was at any point during the Iraq War?
Yeah, that's a pretty sobering thought, and that's just one of the consequences that the book really digs into.
Right. Like it's not just about money, you know. It makes you question like how capitalism shapes everything, you know. Everything from the military to, well,
To the environment, to how we think.
that's what I was going to say. This whole idea of common sense, it's like not just knowing basic stuff, but the underlying beliefs that shape our whole worldview.
Yeah, those beliefs that we often don't even realize we have. And the book argues that those beliefs are very often used to justify the power structures of capitalism.
Okay, so like give me an example. How does that actually play out in real life?
Well, think about the idea that hard work guarantees success.
Okay, yeah, the classic American dream.
Right. But is it really that simple? What about systemic racism or coming from a wealthy family?
Oh, I see what you mean.
It's like those rags to riches stories, right?
Yeah,
They make it seem like anyone can make it if they just try hard enough.
but that ignores all the other factors, right? Like where you were born,
Yeah.
your access to education.
Exactly. The book argues that this common sense narrative actually distracts us from those bigger
It's
issues.
like we're being told to focus on the individual rather than the system.
And it's not just coming from one place either. You see it in movies, TV shows.
Either the news, right?
Yeah. So I think the first step is just becoming aware of these narratives.
That's kind of unsettling, though, isn't it? Like realizing how much our thinking might be shaped by forces we don't even see.
Well, the book uses the example of Edward Bernays as the father of public relations.
Okay, I've heard of him.
Yeah, he argued that you could actually manipulate public opinion through propaganda and the media.
So it's like if you control the narrative, you control people's perception of reality.
Exactly. But the book also points out that these same tactics can be used for good too.
Like to raise awareness about important issues or to counter harmful ideologies.
Right. Think about the civil rights movement, for example. They used powerful imagery and storytelling to really shift public opinion.
Oh, that's a good point. So it's not like we're just uh, helpless pawns in this game.
Not at all. The book emphasizes that common sense isn't static. It changes over time. What was once considered common sense, like women not having the right to vote,
Yeah, good point.
is now seen as absurd.
Yeah,
So challenging those ingrained beliefs is crucial.
totally. But the book goes even further, right? Like it connects capitalism's drive for profit to militarism.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. It introduces this concept of capitalist realism.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that even mean?
So capitalist realism is this idea that it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Wow, yeah, I can kind of see that.
Right. And if we can't even imagine an alternative to capitalism, how can we possibly create a different future? And the book argues that this kind of limited thinking actually contributes to support for military action.
It's like we're so focused on preserving the system that we're willing to use violence to protect it.
Exactly. The book points to the domino theory as a prime example.
Oh, right, that whole idea that if one country falls to communism, others will follow.
Yeah, that fear was used to justify all sorts of interventions in Vietnam, Latin America.
So it's this fear of anything that threatens the capitalist system that drives militarism.
And that militarism, in turn, protects the interests of capitalism. It's a vicious cycle.
Okay, but where does that leave the rest of us? Like the everyday people who aren't, pulling the strings of the system.
Well, that's a question that the book spends a lot of time exploring, because when resources are poured into the military, they're often being diverted from social programs, education,
All the
healthcare.
stuff that actually benefits people.
Exactly. And this ties back into the idea of common sense. We've been conditioned to accept massive military spending as normal, even necessary.
Like it's just part of how things are.
And the media plays a big role in this. They often portray military strength as the ultimate measure of national security.
Right. And any questioning of that is seen as unpatriotic or even treasonous.
Which makes it even harder to have a real conversation about the costs and consequences of militarism.
Okay, so we've talked about the military, but the book also connects capitalism to environmental destruction, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a central argument that capitalism's inherent need for expansion is fundamentally at odds with environmental sustainability.
Like no matter how much we recycle or drive electric cars, the system itself is unsustainable.
Yeah, the capitalist model demands constant growth,
More production, more consumption.
more extraction of resources, and this insatiable appetite is pushing the planet to its limits.
The book actually challenges the idea that overpopulation is the root of our environmental problems, right?
Yes, it's not just about how many people there are.
But about how we're using resources within this capitalist system.
Exactly. It's not that population isn't a factor, but the book argues that focusing solely on population control distracts from the larger systemic issues.
So it's about changing the way we produce and consume, not just having fewer people.
Right. And the book also criticizes the idea that technology alone can solve these problems.
Like carbon capture or geoengineering.
Yeah. Those might offer temporary fixes, but they don't address the underlying issue of unlimited growth in a finite world.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Exactly. And the book is particularly critical of what it calls neoliberalism.
Okay, I've heard that term thrown around a lot. But what does it actually mean? Like, how is it different from just regular capitalism?
Well, neoliberalism takes some of the core principles of capitalism, deregulation, privatization, free markets,
Okay, yeah, those are all familiar.
and it pushes them to the extreme.
So it's not just like letting the market run wild. It's actually about dismantling the things that are supposed to protect people.
Exactly. It leads to things like cuts to social programs and the weakening of unions and a race to the bottom in terms of like wages and environmental standards as corporations just look for the cheapest labor and the least amount of regulation possible.
That sounds kind of scary, honestly. Like, where does that leave the average person?
That's a great question, and one that the book spends a lot of time examining because when you have this kind of system, it creates a lot of instability and precarity for a lot of people.
Right. And the book suggests that neoliberalism isn't just some economic theory. It's an ideology that is like seeped into every corner of our society.
Yeah, it's become so pervasive that we don't even see it anymore. It's like the air we breathe. We just take it for granted.
So if we're all like breathing this neoliberal air,
Yeah.
how do we even begin to challenge it? The book talks about resistance, right? It doesn't just like leave us in this dark place, does it?
No, definitely not. The book actually explores a whole range of resistance movements that have emerged to push back against these negative consequences.
Okay, so what are some examples?
Well, you've got labor unions fighting for workers' rights, environmental activists trying to protect the planet, social justice movements demanding equality. And it's not just happening in one place either. These movements are popping up all over the world.
That's encouraging.
Hmm.
So people are fighting back. But how effective are these movements really? I mean, capitalism seems so entrenched, so powerful. Does the book offer any hope for real systemic change?
It does. It acknowledges the immense power of capitalist systems. But it also emphasizes that systems can and do change.
Okay, so give me some historical examples.
Well, think about the abolition of slavery, the fight for women's suffrage, the civil rights movement. These are all movements that challenge deeply ingrained power structures. And ultimately, they succeeded in bringing about profound social change.
Right, so it's not about like overnight revolutions. It's about long-term struggles that gradually shift the balance of power.
Exactly. And the book highlights some key ingredients for effective resistance.
Okay, so what are they? What makes these movements successful?
Well, collective action is crucial. People coming together to demand change, and education and awareness raising, helping people understand the systems they're living under and the potential for alternatives, and storytelling, creating compelling narratives that can challenge dominant ideologies and inspire action.
So it's not just about protesting in the streets. It's about changing hearts and minds, shifting the cultural conversation.
Exactly. It's about creating a new common sense that reflects the values of justice, equality, and sustainability.
Speaking of changing the conversation, I remember the book had some pretty harsh critiques of the media, like how they play a role in all of this.
Yeah, the book argues that in a system driven by profit, media often ends up reinforcing existing power structures rather than challenging them.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, for one thing, you have corporate control of media, which limits the diversity of perspectives that get heard.
Right, it's like a handful of companies controlling what we see and hear.
And then there's the constant pressure for ratings and profits. which can lead to sensationalism and superficiality in news coverage.
It's like the news has become more about entertainment than information.
Exactly. And the book also points out that media can be used to distract us from important issues, to keep us focused on consumerism and entertainment while ignoring systemic problems.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, bread and circuses keep people entertained and distracted, and they won't notice what's really going on.
Right. But the book also offers some hope in this area. It talks about the rise of alternative media and the potential for citizen journalism to challenge those dominant narratives.
So it's not all bad news. There are ways to push back to challenge the status quo to create a more just and sustainable world.
Absolutely. And the book emphasizes that it's not about waiting for someone else to fix things. It's about each of us taking responsibility, getting informed, getting involved, and using our voices and our actions to create the change we want to see.
This whole idea of personal responsibility is really resonating with me. It's
Mhm.
easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these problems, to feel like our individual actions don't really matter.
I know what you mean. But the book suggests that even small acts of resistance can make a difference.
Like, what kind of small acts are we talking about?
Well, it could be something as simple as having a conversation with a friend or family member about these issues, or supporting a local organization that's working for social or environmental justice, or choosing to buy from companies that align with your values, or simply being more mindful of your own consumption habits.
So it's about recognizing that we're all part of this system and that our choices, our actions, even our everyday conversations contribute to shaping it.
Exactly. We can choose to perpetuate the status quo, or we can choose to challenge it.
And those choices add up. They create a ripple effect that can ultimately lead to real systemic change.
Yes. And the book highlights the interconnectedness of these issues, how capitalism, militarism, environmental destruction, and social injustice are all intertwined.
So it's not about tackling each issue in isolation. It's about recognizing the systemic nature of these problems and working towards solutions that address the root causes.
Exactly. It's about seeing the bigger picture and working together to create a more just and sustainable world for everyone.
Okay, so we talked about how capitalism shapes our economy, our military actions, our relationship with the environment, even our own thoughts. We've explored the concept of common sense and how it can be used to uphold power structures. We've delved into the dark side of neoliberalism and its impact on society. And we've discussed the importance of resistance, the potential for social change, and the role of media in both perpetuating and challenging the status quo. Ew, that's a lot to unpack. What stood out to you the most from this conversation?
You know, what keeps coming back to me is this idea of interconnectedness. It's really struck me how deeply intertwined these issues are. Capitalism, militarism, environmental destruction, social inequality. They're not separate problems. They're all part of the same system.
That's a powerful insight. It means we can't just focus on one issue in isolation. We need to address the system as a whole.
Exactly. And I think that's where the book's analysis of common sense is so crucial, because if we can start to deconstruct those deeply ingrained beliefs that uphold these systems, we can start to imagine and create alternatives.
It's like we need to rewire our brains to see the world through a different lens.
Yeah. And I think that's where the book's discussion of resistance is so hopeful. It shows that people are already doing this work, challenging dominant narratives, building alternative systems, creating new common sense.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless. We have agency. We can choose to be part of the problem or part of the solution.
Exactly. And the book ends with a powerful quote: "The struggles that are most certain to be lost are those that are never taken up."
It's a call to action, an invitation to engage in the struggle for a more just and sustainable world.
And it reminds us that even small acts of resistance can contribute to larger movements for change. It's about showing up, speaking out, and doing what we can wherever we are.
I feel like we could talk about this for hours.
Oh, for sure.
There's so much to unpack in this book.
It really makes you rethink, like, everything.
Yeah, and for me, one thing that just keeps sticking in my mind is that phrase, the vile maxim of capitalism.
Ah, yeah.
All for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. Like, it's such a blunt way to put it, but
It's powerful, right?
it gets to the heart of, like, the ethical problem at the core of this system.
Yeah, when profit is the only goal, it's easy to lose sight of the human cost.
And the book doesn't shy away from those costs.
Definitely not. It's full of examples of exploitation, environmental damage.
But it also shows us, like, the flip side, right? People in communities who are rejecting that vile maxim.
Yeah, people who are choosing cooperation over competition.
People who are actually putting people and the planet first.
Those examples are so important because they show us that another way is possible. It's not just some utopian dream.
Right, it's like we have to start building that different future now.
Exactly. Because our current system is clearly not working for most people or for the planet.
And it all comes back to that idea of common sense, doesn't it? Like what we accept as normal.
If we can change those underlying beliefs, we can change the system.
It's like a massive shift in perspective.
Yeah. We need to question the stories we've been told about how the world works.
Challenge those assumptions that justify inequality and greed.
And start imagining a different kind of future.
So for everyone listening out there, what does all of this mean for you? We've gone deep into the consequences of capitalism, looked at how common sense shapes our thinking, explored ways to resist, and talked about the possibility of creating a different kind of world.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But the question is, what are you going to do with it?
Ask yourself, how are you participating in this system? What choices can you make to change it?
Even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Right. Use your voice, get involved, support organizations that are fighting for a better world.
This deep dive has been intense.
Definitely.
Eye-opening, for sure.
But also hopeful.
Absolutely. It's shown us that change is possible, but it requires all of us to participate.
So keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better future.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.